Okay, in terms of the stuff, deadlines remain unchanged. So exam 1, quizzes part 2. Deadline is Friday, so tomorrow, 11th to 9 p.m. Exam 2 covering part 2, quizzes part 3, April 5th, end of day. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, April 26th, end of day. Exam 5 ends at the normal end of the final, although it's online. And then for the paper, draft deadline, April 4th, +5 deadline, April 9th, merge deadline, April 16th, and the desperation deadline, April 26th. Before finishing up part 2, anything about any previous stuff or stuff that needs more stuff? Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend David Hume talking about skepticism regarding the senses. And as we saw, one thing that makes Hume somewhat unusual is that instead of saying, you know, how or are there objects out there, his question is, why do we believe that these entities exist in a continued way, that is to say they exist when we're not perceiving them, and why do we believe they exist in a distinct way, as to say apart from us? And so his question is not, do they? His question is, why do we think it? And the analogy I've been using is to the monster in the closet. So, you know, parents go to psychologists and say, little Billy thinks there's a monster in the closet. They don't say, what is the monster? They say, why does little Billy think that? Now, Hume says that our perceptions seem, based on, you know, doing a little experiment, to not have an independent existence, or just, you know, or distinct existence, nor continued existence. And one of the reasons he gives for this is he gives kind of a, not really a super dangerous experiment, but if you press the corner of your eye, don't do that because you're behind yourself, is that you'll double the images. You get that double vision. But we, of course, don't think that we can double stuff by doing that. So we can't, you know, take our money, put it on a table, and double our money. And his reasoning, on one hand, seems just kind of like clever and tricky. Like, yeah, sure, if you push your eye, you double stuff, you don't get two things. But when you think about it, he's kind of right. We do it as if we're seeing two things, but we get that the double perception doesn't exist independently and continue apart from us, apart from doing the pushing. And so the good question is, why do we think that the normal and double thing has those qualities? So kind of his reasoning is when you do that, you're pretty sure the other thing doesn't exist, you know, for real, so I think the normal stuff does, which is kind of a clever argument. Now he also notes things that we've seen before. For example, objects, you know, seem to get bigger and smaller as we move towards them, but of course we don't think they really do that. We don't think they really grow or shrink. It just seems like that. And other things like when people get you know, sick. A good example, of course, is like how stuff tastes when you're sick. And there's a condition which is fortunately not super common today called jaundice. And everything takes on kind of a yellow cast. But we don't think when someone has jaundice that the world is turning yellow. And other cases, you know, anything that involves changes in perception, you know, where we believe that that's not real. So just to just go in the jaundice example, if someone's got jaundice and their vision is kind of tinted, you know, a certain color, you wouldn't say, wow, the world is changing color. We get that that's not, the world is not really turning yellow. And so he says we should think, if we think that in that case, it should apply to our so-called normal perceptions. That if our distorted perceptions don't exist independently and continue, then our normal ones wouldn't either. Or so he thinks. So, as we've seen, philosophers want to have that, at least as he characterizes it, that representational realism. So, drawn out with a badly drawn cartoon. The philosophical view he's noting is that we see an object out there, the object is continued and independent, like the backpack or the extra marker or the desk, and then we think that our perception of it is dependent and doesn't continue. So if we look away from the backpack, we think the backpack's still there, far from us, but we accept that our perception stops existing, it doesn't exist unperceived. Now, Hume says that this is basically craziness. Why? Well, his claim is, he says the philosophical view is what he calls appellative remedy. Basically, we're kind of deceiving ourselves, so we feel good. It's another way to think of it is sort of like a painkiller. So it's sort of like if you get a broken leg and you take a lot of painkillers, it doesn't bother you anymore, but your leg's still broken. So kind of his view is, yeah, it's still a broken system, but it makes us so we don't feel quite so bad about it anymore. And he also claims that whatever appeal or power it has, it gets from the popular view, what he calls the vulgar view. So he's got two parts of the proposition. One is, crudely put, it's basically like a painkiller they use to cover up the crappy system. And secondly, whatever appeal it gets from the vulgar, the common sense view. So it ends up in this kind of weird scenario. We're making it up to sort of feel good about our crappy system, but sort of ironically, whatever actual power it's got, it gets from naive or direct realism. And that view is that what we see is what we get. So what he's essentially saying is we have a philosophical system where we say, backpack is real, it's out there, your perception is in your head, when you look away, it's gone. Direct realism is what you see is what you get. So then he goes through each of the parts. The first part is this, that the philosophical system is, again, by my analogy, just like a painkiller. It doesn't really solve the problem. We just kind of feel better about it. And his reasoning is this. In his own Hume way, he's basically going back to the ancient skeptics and sort of repainting their argument, Hume style. Now, if you remember, the ancient skeptical argument was this. The problem the ancient skeptics said is, if you've got a perception of something, like an idea of something, you can never know if it really matches up with something out there. And the reason is because all you've got is your idea. You can't get out of your mind and somehow see this. You can't step out of your head and say, okay, there's me, there's my idea, there's the object, it matches to the object. Because going with my crappy drawing, I'm still just seeing this crappy drawing, because it's still just, this is now in my mind. So the question is, is that still really real? So I'm just kind of pushing the problem back. And so the question would be, okay, I'm thinking of this, but is what I'm seeing actually real, or is it just in my mind? And to solve that, I would need to know that me seeing this is not just in my mind. And of course, I'd have to know that me seeing this is not just forever. Now, what Hume does is he kind of repaints it a little bit. And this gesture, of course, means spray painting, as opposed to paint. Critical distinction there. So Hume's repaint is this. He says, if you're going to say that something causes something else, given his causal theory, you have to be able to observe cases of one thing being followed by another. And so the analysis of causation we saw was, again, with causation, he says, we can't know if there really is causation So the question is, why do we think there is? What are we, psychologically, what are we doing? And so he says, what we do is, we see one thing followed by another, and if it happens often enough, we say, we get in the habit of saying there's a causal connection. You know, in Pavlov's dog gives a good example of that. Yeah, the first time it happens, you're like, I don't know. So for example, if I snap my fingers and the screen went up, you think, well, maybe it's a coincidence. But if at the end of every class, that's how I always put the screen up, you think, well, I guess there's a connection. Maybe there's like a, you used to have the clap on, clap off, maybe there's like a snap up, snap down. And so if we see it often enough, we think there's a causal connection. So in order to engage in that causal thinking, we get to see one thing followed by another. Now, as Hume notes, all we've got is, our mind. We can see one idea followed by another idea, and then you see this happen a lot. Then we think, we're conditioned to think, okay, idea follows idea, idea follows idea. I now imagine a causal connection. But the problem is, we never can do this, at least according to Hume. Here's my idea in the backpack, here's the backpack. So I can't see idea, backpack, then over and over again. So I can look, keep looking in the backpack and get dizzy all over. That I can never make that connection. Because I don't have idea, backpack. Because if I had that, problem solved. Because I would say idea, backpack, one causes the other. What I've got is idea, and I never can make the connection. Because again, his view is you've got to be able to, connect both. And we never can make that connection. And so essentially it's a repaint or a reskin of the original skeptical argument. And it's still, a pretty decent argument. You can never get outside your own head. You're always stuck there. And hopefully other stuff can't get in, because that's like nightmare horror scenarios. Second part of the proposition. Now, essentially his argument is this. His claim is, if you look at the philosophical system, it's got zero support. It's got nothing. So if anybody believes in it, he claims it's got to be getting it from the vulgar system, because it's got none of its own. He claims. And that's the gist of his argument. It's got nothing, so if you believe it, it's because you're just somehow getting, you're somehow sneaking the common sense view in there. So, what's the connection? Well, what we do is this, according to him. We think, at least he's talking about representational realists, we get, if we've been corrupted by science and philosophy, you say to someone, okay, what is it you're actually experiencing? And the answer is, well, I'm just experiencing my perceptions. I'm just experiencing what's going on in my mind. And we also think that when you look at like the backpack and you look away and look back, we're pretty sure, and we think we're having the same perception, that we're perceived, that our, my picture of the backpack is the same perception as my next picture of the backpack. But of course, there's an interruption. I look away, I look, and I think it's the same perception. But there's an interruption. And if there's an interruption, then I have to think maybe it's not the same. You doesn't say this, but we can imagine in the second I look away, someone cleverly swaps out, take backpack. An old, switch, like the shell game. They switch out the shell, or switch out the ball. So what we do is we think, aha, here's like one moment, I look, see the backpack, next moment I see it, but there's a gap. There's a gap where I'm not seeing it, but I say, it's the same thing, I'm just not looking at it, so it keeps on going. But if we think about it, what we realize is this. Our perceptions don't exist unperceived. It's like, where is the flavor of the pizza when you're not tasting it? Nowhere. There is no flavor. So the connection is broken. So our perceptions don't exist independently. They don't exist continuously. And so that doesn't work. So we end up in this weird, scenario where we say, yeah, it keeps on going, but then we think about it and say, well, we got to be totally wrong. Now, although we do, when we think about it, we think our perceptions don't exist, continue, reject their independence. He says, this is a skeptical view, and he says, even the skeptics really don't believe this. And we'll see, why in just a few moments at the end. So essentially, we end up, as he thinks it, that representational realism, we realize it's crap, and then we try to make it work, but it doesn't. And then we just, kind of have a problem. So as he sees it, we end up in the following mess. So while we're doing, philosophy and science and corrupted by it, we're like, yeah, this makes sense. Got the idea in my mind, there's objects out there, my ideas are my objects, that's like perception 101. And it's what they teach, I guess, in schools and science classes, etc. But of course, our natural feelings are that is direct realism. Because in our normal, every course of the day, if someone says, where's the backpack, where's the color, you would just say there. And then, but in a philosophy class, you'd say, oh, but of course the idea of the backpack is just in my mind. But in the normal course of the day, we're direct realists in normal life, and only representational realists when we think about the science and philosophy. So we end up with this weird struggle, because our imagination tells us that our perceptions just keep on going. Basically naive or direct realism. What we see is what we do. We see the backpack exists when we're no longer looking at it, it keeps on going. But reason tells us that our perception of the backpack goes away when we're not thinking about it, but we also think the backpack keeps on going itself. So we end up with a double scenario. Backpack is out there, our perception's in here, this is like that somehow. Now, Hume says this self-destructs because if we really, really, really believed that our perceptions continued, we really believed direct realism, that our perceptions kept on going, distinct, etc., we wouldn't have representational realism. Because if you believe that what you see is what you get, you wouldn't have this system. And if we really believed that our perceptions were, not independent, that they were dependent, non-continued, we wouldn't believe in objects, we would be just a phenomenologist. We would just say it's all in our minds. Essentially what he's saying is, basically going down, he's saying you can't be a representational realist. Because if you think it through, you're either going to have to be a direct realist, what you see is what you get, or the only other sensible option is to be a phenomenologist, which is what you see is what you get, but it's all in your mind. There's nothing out there, it's just in your mind. Or so he claims. So we then end up, even though he claims this is what we think about, this is what we do, again we end up saying, okay, the perception is dependent, non-persistent, the object is independent and persistent. So we realize we're totally wrong, yet we refuse to accept our wrongness. This is politics. So why do we like this? Well, essentially it lets us have our cake and eat it too, because we can say to ourselves, we're thinking this through, and then just go back to our natural notions. Now, he makes the point here, which is the point he commonly makes, that philosophers, kind of crudely put, are just kind of creating problems out of nothing. How so? Well, he says, when philosophers are going about their normal business, being people instead of philosophers, they don't believe this. They just go around acting just like they did when they were, well, not every way, but hopefully made some improvements. But they, as a practical matter, they think that, they're direct realism. They're looking at a blue folder, blue is real, blue is out there. So, into the home stretch for him, what he says is this. We suppose philosophically or scientifically, representational realism. This corresponds to this, and at first that seems, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But given Hume's theory of cause and effect, we can't make that connection. Now Hume, again, he's repainting the old argument that we looked at, namely, I can't see this resembling this, so I can't make that connection. And he's just throwing in his causal theory. So we have no basis to make this claim. So what do we do? Well, we imagine. We imagine that, my idea of the backpack at this moment, I look away, I look back, and I just imagine it's the same thing. So it's the imagination. So we assume this, and what we do is we imagine this causes this, but it's just total imagination, and we imagine that this keeps on going. So essentially, the psychoanalysis is this. We are delusional. That we come up with this, it's like a conspiracy theory. We come up with this crazy theory, and we really want to believe it.
So,
yeah, then we're literally just imagining. We're just, there's stuff out there. It's kind of like, UFO conspiracy theory. There's UFOs out there, they control the government. And we're just making stuff up according to him. Now, he ends up being kind of disappointed because he thought he could be like an empiricist. Namely, we should trust our senses, and once we go through the reasoning, we'll say, of course empiricism is correct. But then where he gets is, oh my God, there's no fun. We're just crazy. It's like someone who says, of course there are psychic powers. And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. We're just making all this up. So he thinks there's no rational foundation for this system. It's all make-believe. So why? Well, again, he ends up sort of repainting classic skepticism. Namely, we imagine our perceptions keep on going, it's the same thing, but it's just an illusion. And then we have this illusion that it's the same thing, and we make up the idea that our perceptions keep on going, they're uninterrupted, and so philosophers say, on one hand, the perception is not, you look away, you look back, not the same thing. My idea of the backpack is not identical. But the backpack is real, and it keeps on going. And he says, we have no basis for that whatsoever. Now, as he notes, this is, skepticism. We can never know. And he says, well, he describes it as a disease, that it's a malady, and we can actually never cure it. It's like, you always got it. So, what? Well, here's the problem. The more, in the way it's kind of a paradox, the more we try to prove that we know the external world, the more we disprove it. It'd be kind of like, it's, imagine, I was kind of thinking a scenario where someone like, they make a cake and, you know, someone comes along and says, ooh, cake, I'll just take a little bit of frosting. And they're like, oh crap, there's a clear mark. And they're trying to like move the frosting to cover it, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and at the end it's just a total disaster. You know, they're just making, they should have just like stopped, you know, stopped at the first one, because maybe they wouldn't notice. And so the more we try to fix it, the worse, it's like a, you know, kind of like a Three Stooges routine. The more you try to fix it, the worse it keeps getting worse and worse. So how do we solve it? Well, what he says is this: the only cure is not to care. So he says what happens is, as you reason through this, in a way it's kind of like going into, you're putting yourself into the rabbit hole. You're getting into the whole conspiracy, you're putting pictures on the wall and connecting them with red, you know, strings, and everything's crazy. And the only way to get away from the craziness is to walk out of the crazy room, close the door, and don't come back. And essentially what he says is, in his own case, once he goes down to the tavern and starts drinking, he's gonna say, yeah, you know, if you say, hey Dave, is beer real? He'd say, you bet, I like another. And so he ends up essentially doing a psychoanalysis. We are crazy. What do you think this version of realism is? Craziness. It's a conspiracy theory. No foundation. Is there any way to reason your way out of it? Well, no. It's like getting into conspiracy theory, and the more you try to reason about it, the deeper you dig yourself into the rabbit hole. It's like trying to fix that cake. It just keeps getting worse. Anything to do is just walk away. So why do we believe this? Because we're crazy. What should we do? Stop being crazy. And he says just natural impulse will just, you know, if we stop thinking about philosophy, even the most crazy skeptic just goes back to normal eventually. So have some beer. That's the solution to skepticism. In a way, it's kind of disappointing because you go through all this, you know, argument and stuff, and the end is have a beer, don't worry. Or a beverage of your choice. It could be like something healthy, like more beer. So that kills off part 2. Before getting to part 3, the 3-ing, anything about 2, the 2-ing, that needs more 2. So part 3, we're going to look at the apriori, or apriori. I did that just so it would rhyme. I try to design all my section headings for rhymes. We'll also look at the criterion, which doesn't rhyme, and Gettier, and we looked at foundationalism and coherentism, and we'll also look at externalism and internalism, to the other camps. And of course, there's always no expense made for the finest free Microsoft clip art. But only the finest free things will do. Now, as we've seen, as we've gone through the epistemology, one of the core battles is a priori versus a posteriori. And again, the idea is a priori is, again, from what is prior, and that's the idea you can know stuff just by pure reason. So you can just be sitting there, you know, thinking, and you can know things. A posteriori, from what is posterior, is after experience. And again, sort of like put in a kind of cartoonish bumper sticker way, if you believe in a priori knowledge, it means you can know stuff just by pure reason. Now, it doesn't mean that you would just necessarily automatically just be in your head, but if you work through it, you'd reach it without actually going in like looking. A posteriori is you have to have experiences, and that's where you know stuff. Now, pretty much all philosophers, if they think that you can know stuff, they would say, yeah, you can know some stuff, you can know this stuff. Kind of the general view, if you were to talk to like the philosopher, are there some things you know by pure reason? And they'd say, yeah, 2 + 2 is 4. Are there some things you have to know by like looking? And pretty much every philosopher would say like, yeah, where my car keys are, or what the score of the baseball game is. You can't sit down and just work that out in your mind. So the battle is, in one part, do we even have knowledge of these types? And then kind of the biggest battle is what belongs in these pockets or buckets. You know, what kind of things go in it. So the general view kind of is, yeah, we got that, but what goes in those buckets? And of course, the skeptic says you don't got any of that, or they might say you don't got this and you got this, or vice versa. So kind of the question, big question is, if you accept this stuff, what goes in the buckets? Now, we'll look at our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646, 1716, died, still dead today. Now, a little background for him. He, again, as we saw earlier, lived in the German region, because during the time period that Leibniz was Leibnizian, Germany wasn't like unified into Germany. It was a collection of states that were later unified under Bismarck. Now, you probably know if you heard of the Cold War, Germany was divided east and west, but before it was unified, there were, you know, there's like Prussia and so forth, and so Germany was kind of made itself. You know, it decided, okay, this is going to be Germany, and pretty much most states were kind of that way. You know, it wasn't like France has always been there and Germany has always been there. People just kind of like conquered some stuff and, you know, said, hey, this is our stuff. Usually by stealing it from other people. They'll probably steal it from other people. They'll steal it from other people whoever was there first. Now, Leibniz claimed there are two types of truth. Now, again, he's not talking about facts and alternative facts. He's not saying something can be true for some and not true for others. What he means is there are like true things, and some of the truths go into one bucket, some go to the other. He's not saying something could be like in the true bucket and the false bucket at the same time. He's saying that there are truths, but they go certain places. We get them a certain way. The posteriori truths are what he calls contingent truths of fact. Contingent means essentially it could be, or maybe it doesn't have to be. It's something, you know, it's what we call, you know, possibility. And so a good example would be, well, pretty much everything we experience in normal life. Well, like wondering like what's in the backpack or what's in the box, like in movie 7. Great line, what's in the box? Such a good movie. Creepy, especially now we think of like Kevin Spacey, so super creepy. But so if the question is, you know, is there a green folder in there? It's something there could be, because I could take it out. And so it could be true one moment, and I could pull it out, and then it's not true. And the only way to get to that truth is you gotta look. There are also a priori truths, truths of reason. And these go back to our good dead friend Aristotle. Aristotle said, he's the guy that gets credited with like really laying out logic. Did he invent logic? No, because people were thinking before Aristotle, but he, you know, wrote that stuff down. It's kind of like how Apple, they didn't invent the smartphone or the MP3 player. They just waited for other people to like make all kinds of terrifying mistakes and said, okay, let's just make ours better from their terrible mistakes. Yeah, in fact, Apple was actually pretty late to the whole phone and thing, but they, you know, they did the Apple thing, and everybody's going to have the Apple. Yeah, the Apple thing. I think that's going to be the next thing. You know, Cook will get up there and be like, the i thing. Now, Aristotle laid out the foundational principle of logic is that A is equal to A, that each thing is what it is. Now, in a way, someone would say, well, duh. But that's Aristotle's point exactly. Duh. It is something that is a truth that cannot be denied. Because if you say A is not A, you can say the words, but that's clearly not true. And you don't have to look. Like if someone says, is the blue folder the blue folder? You'd say, yeah, I don't have to look. Like if you say, is the green folder in my backpack a green folder? Yeah, it is what it is. Is there a green folder in there? You gotta look. And so in a way, this seems like a duh, but it's kind of the point. Things that are like, these are the duhs of the duh. Namely that to deny them would be just absurd. Although people do, because there's nothing so absurd that someone doesn't believe. Now, the other person we'll look at in this area, this is kind of the, I guess the opening credits of the section for flashing up, scenes from what is to come, which is a good way to pad out the runtime of the show. It's like a lot of shows are, especially like anime, nothing to do with this, but they have like 5-minute intro and like a recap, and then they have like an ending where they recap and do some stuff in credits, so you actually only get like 10 minutes of show. Which is why Netflix is really good, because you do that skip intro and kind of, it's like, especially when you're binging, it's like, I don't want to see that 600 times. I've only liked this like that. It's like skip intro. We'll also look at our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, 1724, 1804, dead, still dead. What he's known for is getting this, what's called the synthetic a priori going, at least in this case, plus a lot of other stuff. Now, like Leibniz, he believed in the a posteriori and a priori, and pretty much every philosopher, almost everyone does. What they do is they just kind of tweak it a little bit, kind of their own brain. Again, going like with the smartphone analogy, all smartphones are basically kind of the same. You get a phone, and it's got like apps and a camera and a phone thing. And then people have different, different designs, different features. So for Kant, a posteriori judgments depend on empirical experience. The a priori don't depend on empirical experience. So still pretty standard. But what he kind of threw in there, a large part was just is giving it a name, is the synthetic a priori. Now the way synthetic is, especially today, may seem kind of like an odd thing. Because I remember when I first heard it, I thought synthetic, is it like polyester or plastic or something? That or worry that maybe it's a carcinogen. I shouldn't be around it because I don't want to get the brain cancer. Fortunately, no, it's safe-ish. Synthetic a priori is kind of a weird thing. And one of the reasons, many reasons Kant is famous is because he really pushed this notion. Again, he didn't like create it out of nothing, but he's the one that, kind of like an Apple and iPhone, he kind of wrote it out, got it going. Well, got it out there. Now, synthetic a priori is a priori because we don't get it from our experiences. So that's the a priori part. Now the synthetic part means not that it's like fake or plastic. He means that it's about the world. So we don't get the knowledge through our senses, but it's about the world. And as we'll see in the future, the way he kind of works this trick, or brilliance, is that it's knowledge that all our experience presupposes. So in a way, we don't get it from our experience. To have that experience, it's already going to be in there. To use a terrible analogy, it's kind of like a filter that we've always got going. When you do a filter on something like in your phone, the filter doesn't come from out there. It's something you put on what's coming into your phone. So, and again, this metaphor kind of blows up pretty quick, but in a way it kind of works. It's like a filter that's always applied to the default filter, which is actually still a filter. It's when it comes in, it always gets filtered. And the a priori, synthetic a priori, would be that filter. He also claims it's logically necessary. So you got to have it. So that would be, well, what makes it, I guess, important or magic is it does, we'll see more about this in the future, seemingly smushes together two things that should not be compatible, like oil and water, cats and dogs, burritos and iguanas. So you've got something you know prior to experience about the world. Now the synthetic a posteriori knowledge, that's like normal a posteriori knowledge. That's like knowing stuff about the world that is contingent, doesn't depend on, this analysis. And that would be something like, there's a backpack on the table. Now, we'll see quite a bit of Kant because he was super important, and people who get paid to teach Kant still think he's super important. You just ask them. You know, the people who build their entire career about Kant, they did a dissertation on Kant. They just teach Kant. That's all they do. All the Kants, which is just fine.
Question.
Yes.
It was about how you were saying that the synthetic a priori knowledge is like a filter. So is this something that we're born with?
He seems to think that it's just it's built in. I mean, today he might have, you know, if he studied like evolutionary theory and brain theory, he might. We don't know for sure, but he might say that that's, if you wanted a physical explanation, it'd be like the wiring of the brain, that we are pre-wired, just like, to use an analogy, just like we are seeing color is based on our brain wiring. Like we see things differently than like bees or dogs or iguanas do because of our wiring. This would be like the wiring. So
similar to like intuition?
And in a way, yeah, because it's built in and it's there, and then you just sort of process, things come in a way you process it without even realizing you're processing it. It just you know, because with intuition, you just kind of feel it without realizing that you're doing anything. Yeah, so it's automatic. We don't realize we're doing this. So when you look, it's not like when you look at stuff, you have a little like loading bar, like now colorizing. It's just instant. And he says when we have this experience, we instantly do that. We don't see any separation, which is good because otherwise we'd be in trouble. We'd be like now loading, we'd be like, oh God, let's go. It's like, oh there's the car. Too late. Now, as might be imagined, there is not only just the epistemic part, like how do we know, there's also typically a corresponding metaphysical part, namely what there is. And of course there's always a connection, you know, what there is, what do we know about it. So there's a priori knowledge, which we know, it doesn't depend on the senses. And again, it's something you could, in theory, just be sitting there and just think about and know it just by thinking. A posteriori knowledge, again, depends on evidence from the senses. And again, like, you know, triangles having three sides, and this would be like, there's a triangle in my backpack, or snake in my boots, is what you would say. Metaphysical categories. Now, one way to sort of provide a foundation for these epistemic categories is the metaphysics behind them. Now, a priori truths are typically seen as necessary truths. So one reason why, if you want to say like, well, how do we know they're always true? And one way to cash this out metaphysically is to say, you know they're true because they're true in every world that is possible. So you don't have to look because there's no way they're not true. So any world that could be, that will be true there. Now, one interesting part of metaphysics, in large part because it ends up, you know, being a popular thing in Hollywood and in sci-fi, is this notion of possible worlds. It also is important in science because one of the things in science is the question of what things have to be that could not be changed, that they must always be and could not be any different, and what things could be different. I mean, to use like kind of a boring example, triangles. If you went into like alternative realities, triangles would still be triangles. You know, use like the Star Trek example. If you're familiar with Star Trek, back, was it 2009, J.J. Abrams, the Lost guy, he rebooted the Star Trek franchise. And what he did was, you know, you've got the normal timeline, like if you're a Star Trek fan, like a nerd like I am, because if you're in philosophy, you just gotta watch Star Trek, it's the contract. That's one of the questions for your dissertation, do you watch the Star Trek? And you'd say, and they'll say, well, what's your favorite episode? And what's Mr. Spock's real name? And the answer is, you couldn't pronounce it. That is the correct answer. So in the normal one, you've got, you have like Star Trek Voyage, Star Trek Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, etc. And what J.J. Abrams did is he had, the time travel thing, but his explanation is all that stuff still happened in the normal timeline, but there was a branch off. So the movie universe branches off from the old, the old TV and older movies. So it's not that he's rewritten the old Star Trek. All that still fictionally happens. It's an alternative universe. And if you go into that universe, the triangle is still a triangle. And of course, Star Trek also had the mirror universe, like we have all the evil versions of Kirk and Spock and stuff. But even there, triangles are still triangles. Now, so one interesting question philosophically and also scientifically is, are there things that no matter what world you went to, they would have to be the same? So would there always be triangles? One of the most interesting ones scientifically, though, is think of like the constants in our universe that seem to be maybe constants. Things like the gravity, the elements, all the laws of physics. Are they the same like everywhere, or could they be different? So if you were somehow able to go into other possible worlds, would the laws of physics still be the same? For example, to use an example from this writer, Roger Zalaska, he wrote a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, one of them being The Nine Princes in Amber. And in the book, Nine Princes in Amber, the series, the idea is that there's all kinds of multiple realities, and some people can move through them. So in our world, gunpowder works, so we have guns. In other worlds, it doesn't work, so they have to use swords and bows and stuff, not because they don't know about guns, but because guns don't work, because gunpowder doesn't function. So kind of an interesting question is, what kind of worlds could there be in terms of what would work and what wouldn't work? Would gunpowder always work? Would, does, like our inverse square law, does our formulas, do they work everywhere? And so a necessary truth would be, if you had like a dimensional travel thing, like Rick and Morty, your portal gun, and no matter where you went, there'd always be like things that are always the same. And those would be necessary truths because they can never not be true. You can never find a world where they're not true. Now, contingent truths are ones that are true here, but you could go to a world where they're not true. So kind of interesting debate, in which is something, both scientists and sci-fi writers think about is, could there be other realities, and what things could change and what couldn't? So we think, yeah, maybe there's an alternative timeline where Donald Trump lost, and Hillary Clinton is, president. So that we think, yeah, that's possible. But we probably can't imagine a timeline where triangles don't exist, or 2 + 2 is not 4. And one way we can kind of do like a priori science is, if we know the necessary truths, we could say, yeah, whatever world exists has got to have these features, and what things can change. And so that's the metaphysics of it. What are all the worlds like? And thanks to shows like Rick and Morty and Star Trek and stuff, and Doctor Who, makes it easier to do metaphysics and epistemology. Because before that it was just like, probably the external world. And now it's like Black Mirror, Matrix. Now I mentioned the synthetic, and so here's some more about the synthetic. Now one distinction that philosophers either like or hate a whole bunch, and some people, as we'll see when we talk about our good dead friend Quine, they claim there's no distinction, it's just the mess. Now, philosophy tends to break into 2 big camps. There's what's called analytic philosophy, typically what's called like, I guess, American philosophy, British philosophy, There's also what's called continental philosophy, because it's what's done on the continent of Europe. And to be honest, I have no idea what continental philosophy is, because I know what I do, and I've talked to continental philosophers saying, what is it that you do? And they'll say, it's a storm in the bottle. It is language confronting itself as itself. I'm like, what the hell could that even mean? And so that could be my feeling, I just don't understand what they do. Now, the analytic tradition goes back to, well, all the way back to like Socrates and stuff. But here's what analytic supposedly means. And we'll see pretty quickly why, on one hand, you say, yeah, this is a good distinction, and quickly say, oh boy, it's actually crap. First thing is this. The claim is, if you have an analytic claim, and here's how they cash it out. Supposedly, the predicate is contained in the subject. So if you say, for example, a triangle is three-sided, your subject is triangle, your predicate is three-sided, and that somehow it's contained within it. And the metaphor I'll use is this. You could take the metaphor of containment to mean like, in a literal, not even a literal sense, take it metaphorically like the literal sense, that it has in it somehow those properties. Now, I'll use the metaphor to sort of make this maybe appealing. Think of like chemical analysis. Suppose you're a chemist for NASA, and you're designing the next Mars probe or Jupiter probe. And what you want it to do is, say, get some of that atmosphere on, Saturn and see what it is. So you do an analysis to see what it contains. And so there would be like a gas, and then it would contain stuff. So this would be the subject, gas, Jupiter gas, and this would be the ingredients. So you're analyzing it to get the ingredients. And that makes sense, like analyzing food. If you're working for the FDA and you're analyzing medicine or food to see what's in it, you're doing a literal analysis. And we get that. So metaphorically, people who accept these analytical truths, in a way they're kind of saying, if you were able to analyze the subject triangle, you could find within that, that's like running like a philosophical analysis, you'd somehow find in there three-sided. Now in the case of the scientific analysis, that the food contains like insect parts through analysis, that makes sense. The soup has insect parts. And interestingly enough, food is always allowed a certain percentage of stuff. Because it's harmless, it's mostly harmless. Because we eat insects all the time. We all eat a lot of insects. Not knowingly, but we've all eaten a lot of insects. But it's cool because they're good protein. Yeah, the more you know, the scarier life is. So this kind of makes sense. But then, of course, as we'll see, this metaphor seems kind of weird because, yeah, I get this. I run like a gas, spectrograph or run a chemical test. But how do I do it with language? How does that even work? And critics have said, yeah, nice metaphor, but what does that even mean? Now, the idea is that it's expletive, not amplitive. In other words, it doesn't give you anything new. It just says, in a way, it just sort of says what is. I mean, to give like an example, if you're told triangles have three sides, if you know what a triangle is, you've learned nothing. You're going to be like, oh my God, I had no idea that triangles were three-sided. Because if you know what triangle is, you know they're three-sided. Synthetic. In this case, the idea is that the predicate is not contained in the subject, so no matter how much you analyze the subject, you wouldn't find the predicate. You have to go and like look, so to speak. So it's not contained in it. So it tells you something new that you wouldn't get just by analyzing the term. So to use a silly example, if I say the triangle has three sides, the idea is you can analyze triangle and see, yes, it contains three-sidedness. But if I say the triangle is blue, you'd have to look. Because no matter how much you analyze triangle, color's not in there. So it's not in the subject. So it tells you something new. So if I say, now to use another example, if I say bachelors are unmarried, that wouldn't be a shock. Because you know what bachelors are by definition, unmarried men. But if I say Trump is a bachelor, you'd be surprised because you think that he's married, but maybe he's not. So that would be something potentially surprising. Because no matter how much you analyze Trump, you wouldn't find bachelor or not. So in a way, this sort of gets its power because it does kind of seem to make sense. Okay, analytic, if I know what this means, then I don't have to go and look, I get it. Okay, triangle, three-sided, bachelor, married, I don't have to check. But then the synthetic adds something new. I don't know if the triangle, in the box is blue or green. So if you play guess the sides and someone says there's a triangle in the box, you go 3. If you're playing guess the color, that's a tougher game because then you have so many options. Now again, the problem is that even though it's like a nifty metaphor, the problem is what does it mean to contain? What does it mean to analyze? And critics have said, yeah, that's just a metaphor. So it really just, once you really kind of push it, like all metaphors, it just kind of burns up. Now, philosophers, especially going back to Kant, have tried to like smush this stuff together. And here's a handy chart of smushing. So we have here the a priori, stuff that is known based on pure reason prior to experience. We have the a posteriori, stuff that you would know through experience. Then we have the analytic, which again would be metaphor, it contains, and synthetic, in which it doesn't contain. In other words, that in a way it gets you something new when you know it. And this is kind of like, again, this would be like duh, that like each thing is what it is, and these are like, oh yeah, I totally see that, but wow, something new. So here's how it goes. The analytic a priori, or the a priori analytic, depending on where you want to put your terms, these would be logical entailments, like, doing like proof in logic. Identity statements, like A is A. Tautologies, like, A or not A. And of course definitions, like all bachelors are unmarried, or all triangles are three-sided. And so that is that these are things you just know without looking, and you get them by, the claim is, analysis. The analytic a posteriori, well, the usual view is nothing. Because if you're getting just by analysis, it wouldn't be a posteriori. You can't have that. Now moving to the synthetic column, there is the a posteriori synthetic and the synthetic a priori. Now synthetic a priori is the one that's the kind of the most controversial. It's the one that Kant really, as we'll see in the future, really wanted to fight for because he thought it was super important. Now Kant thinks math belongs here, and we'll see why in the future, because normally we would think of math as being here, analytic a priori. But Kant thinks that math is synthetic a priori, because he thinks that you don't go and look to know that 5 and 7 is 12, but he claims no matter how much you analyze 5 plus and 7, you wouldn't get 12. And again, one problem is, what's analysis? What does that even mean? So that's kind of a problem. We don't even know what the terms are supposed to mean. He also claims that exclusionary claims would also be synthetic a priori. For example, if you're told that something is red, just red, and then the next question was, suppose that this is just red, is it green? You would say, Well, if someone said, is my red shirt green? You'd say, no, it's red. Wouldn't have to look. You know, if someone's like, what color is my red shirt? And is my completely red shirt green? You'd say, your completely red shirt is red and it's not green. Why aren't you looking? I don't have to look. Now, I don't mean like it went through the wash. Now, like the red shirt is like, you know, pink or something, but you know, it's red. And of course, this is something we don't get by analysis, supposedly. The claim is, no matter how you analyze red, you wouldn't get like not green in there. But it's something we don't have to look at claims. Also, in the case of Kant, he believed that the presuppositions of experience, in other words, again, like the filters, that space, time, and causality, they're built in. To use a metaphor, they're like hardwired into our mind. Also, he thought, if you take the ethics class, you'll see this in terrifying detail, he believed that moral judgments were in this category. Namely, that you don't get ethics by analysis, but you get them, they are a priori, you don't have to go and look, and they tell you something new. And Kant's moral system, if you haven't had the logic class or rough play with Kant's ethics, is this classic categorical imperative. And he believed that if you use this categorical imperative, and this is clearly what it is this, that the base version is, if you want to do something, you have to be willing to allow everyone else to do the same thing too, rationally and logically. Crudely put, it's okay for me to do if everyone else could do it too, said when I'm not like insane or something. And Kant thinks that if we use this categorical imperative, we'll be able to, without looking, we don't have to go and check, you know, well, would torture people for fun, could that be okay? You don't have to go and like, okay, let's do some torture and see how this goes. He claims we would know a priori that torture is bad. It's something new we've learned, but we wouldn't have to go and try. We would say, okay, you know, get the car battery and the alligator clips and let's get going. No, you need to sit there and think about it and say, I know it's bad. Logic, he thinks, also is here, that it tells us something new, but it's a priori. And he thinks that some metaphysical claims are synthetic a priori. He believes that God's existence and free will are things that we don't get through experience. In fact, he says experience seems to tell against them. But these are things that are true, and we know not by analysis, but we know that they're true a priori. And again, this is kind of the problem here, because Kant really, really wants this. And the reason why is because David Hume ruined everything. And Kant was trying to unruin it. And so we get this stuff. Now, with the synthetic a posteriori, it's the easy, super easy. This would be anything we say about the world that tells us something about the world, but not based in pure reason. Like, you know, copper conducts electricity, John is a bachelor, Trump is president, and those are things we couldn't get through analysis. We have to go and look. So this and this, pretty much everyone's kind of like, okay, yeah, bachelors are married, no problem. You got to go look to see if all copper conducts electricity, because maybe there's something that's copper that's got like a weird property. It's still copper, but it just doesn't conduct. Maybe there's like something you can do to copper. It's like, yeah, it's still copper, but wow, that totally blocks electricity. Or knowing someone is a bachelor, you have to check. So those are the four categories. And again, the big fight is here. Before moving on from this fine, high-quality graphic, anything about needs more stuff? Now, Kant claims we can't have analytic a posteriori knowledge. Why? Well, in a way, this seems kind of sensible. Because the analytic involves just analysis. It doesn't involve experience. Now, you might say, well, when I'm analyzing something, isn't analysis like an experience? Can I put that on my resume? Analyze a lot of stuff. And the answer is, well, no, it's not experience of just like doing something, it's sensory experience. Because the a posteriori depends on, again, getting sensory stuff. So the analytic can't be a posteriori because it'd be saying what you get just by analysis, you know, in the metaphorical sense, you don't have to look. So a person's answer to this question, these questions about this stuff, is kind of like, you know, to use an analogy to politics, it's like asking people, you know, do you believe in climate change? If the answer is yes, and then you say, do you believe in like free college tuition? You say yes, then you're probably like a Democrat. And here it would be, if you say, do you believe there's synthetic a priori? You say yeah, then you're probably a rationalist. If you say no, none of that stuff, probably an empiricist. So rationalists claim, at least some of them, there's synthetic a priori knowledge. You can know stuff about the world by pure reason. Empiricists say none of that stuff. They do typically believe in analytic a priori. Like if you ask an empiricist, how do you know triangles have three sides? You have to look, they'd say no, it's by definition. The rationalists think you can discover at least some truths that are not empirical and also not analytical. In other words, you don't have to look, and they're not just based on doing an analysis. Now again, it's not all of them, because you can be a rationalist and say, I'm a rationalist, but I'm not going to accept that crazy stuff. The most radical rationalists claim everything you know must be based in self-evident, a priori, non-empirical knowledge. This would be like the most extreme rationalism. So somehow everything, in a way, kind of like what Descartes was kind of promising, because he said, you know, kind of his promise was this: you find a self-evident truth, and then you have, you know, valid deductive reasoning, and you plug in the truths, you get more truth. And so if that was delivered, you would have this. You'd be able to know everything just by sitting there and thinking and plugging self-evident truths into deductive valid, you know, sound, creating sound arguments, taking their conclusions, plugging them into more arguments, and just sitting there, you can know all of the things. And that's extreme. Even Descartes, as we saw, he's kind of like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. Then he's like, I guess I can't deliver that. I can't do that. It's kind of like, you know, if you're getting a contract with the state, the company says, yeah, we'll be able to do this incredible web portal for, you know, this, and it'll be awesome and super, and then you're like, well, I guess we couldn't actually do that, and then give us more money, is what they always say. We're doing a terrible job, give us more money. It is totally true. Synthetic a priori knowledge. This is that somehow we can grasp connections between ideas that are not strictly analytically related. In other words, we know it's true, but we're not doing it by analysis. And again, this is kind of the biggest of fighting points. Can you have this stuff? And some people say, sure. Other people say, what? No way. Before pressing on in our remaining minutes, anything about that? These more stuff. Now, Kant wrote some really big and punishing books. So not the worst though. They're probably the worst were Hegel and Heidegger. So if you like ever want to suffer like a lot in reading, read some Hegel and Heidegger. Kant is still pretty tough. So I remember in grad school I was in a class and one of my fellow grad students pointed out that there was like an entire page in a textbook. I mean, like a big size textbook, and the entire page was one sentence. It just had colons and semicolons running all through it. It's like, yeah, I was like, wow, that's. I think he was just going for it's probably the longest sentence, you know. That wasn't created just to be the longest sentence. It was crazy. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of people have made their careers analyzing Kant. And these are people that are famous philosophically, which, as I mentioned, is not famous at all. It's like the person who's got a gold medal in curling. Somebody's got it. Two people got it, actually, because you have the sweeper and the thrower. But we don't know. Google knows, but we don't know who they are. No, so according to this fellow Ewing, he claims that Kant makes 4 claims about the synthetic a priori judgments. First, they're logically necessary wholes that determine their own parts. So they've always got to be true. Secondly, you don't get them from particular sensations. Namely, you don't actually get them from empirical experience. So you couldn't like look at your experience and say, aha, that's where they're getting in there. But he claims, and this is how they connect to the empirical experience, the empirical experience triggers them. So in a way you could say, yes, if you never had empirical experience, these ideas would never be activated. I mean, to use an analogy, it'd be like if we put cameras on a space probe, never expose them to light, and then send this probe out, and the camera lens is never opened. So the camera would never actually be triggered. It would still be a camera, but it's never be triggered. So, for example, if you never had experience, it makes sense to say you would never have the idea of like visible space. And Kant says it would still be in there, it just would never be activated, it would never be switched on. He also claims these are all presupposed in our experience. And again, we'll see in the future of this in detail. Space is a good example. It's one of Kant's examples. But the idea is we can't have the experience that we're having without the space filter in there. And we don't get it from out there, it's built in here, and then when we have an experience, it gets activated, it gets switched on. And they come from our minds. So they're, again, with my tarot metaphor, it's like, even though if you go like on Instagram or something, or Facebook, you have the various filters you can put on, but even unfiltered, there's still a filter in a sense. So these are kind of these are the default filters. And they're so filtery, we don't even realize they're being filtered. Now, as mentioned again for Kant, the synthetic a priori is that's kind of his big deal here. So, how does it work? Well, again, he claims that these are presuppositions or conditions of experience, that you couldn't have this experience without that being built in. I mean, to use a tarot analogy, it'd be like you couldn't have your image filtered that way unless you had the filter. Now, one of the problems that Kant runs into, and we'll see this, it's a battle between, well, it's kind of the question of how do you know what's behind experience? Now, as we'll see in the future, Kant claims that there is the phenomena. That is what we experience. So, example, oh, look around. Phenomena. And then he claims behind that is what he calls the noumena, which is the real stuff. And obviously, what the problem is that the way Kant sets it up, as we'll see, he wants to say there's a noumena, but we have no way of knowing that there is noumena or what it is. So next time, we'll pick up with synthetic a priori knowledge, so have a good weekend, and I guess have some experiences with synthetic a priori.